Dr. Bickmore's Why Wednesday in Conversation. And today my guest is the author Fred Bowen. Fred, glad to have you.
Well, I'm delighted to be here, Steve.
Well, it's one of those great gifts when you're an academic and you work with young adult literature and children's literature. Sometimes you get gifts in the mail, and you think, wait a minute. I need a good baseball book to start the summer and to share with my grandkids and others. And so I started when I got this book. I thought, Fred Bowen, I don't know him, and why shouldn't I? Shouldn't I know him? And I looked it up, and I am amazed at how prolific you've been, Fred. And you publish with Peachtree pretty regularly, right?
I
And
have published Extra Innings is the latest, the 26th series book, the Fred Bowen Sports Stories series. And what it does is it combines sports fiction, sports history, and there's always a chapter of sports history at the back.
yeah,
And one of the things you learn, and it's humbling as a writer, is as much as I have been around for a long time, there are still people who don't know me. I also published with Simon and Schuster a book called Gridiron and a book called Hardcourt. Those are histories for young readers of the NFL and the NBA. And I also wrote a kids sports column for the Washington Post for almost 23 years.
wow,
Didn't
wow.
quite make it to 23. They discontinued the kids post page um, a year ago, February.
Oh, that's in some ways that's too bad. But newspapers, as we know them,
Yeah.
are changing. But I'm gonna have to next time at a conference, I'm gonna have to talk to Peachtree because I've known some of the people at Peachtree for a while. But again, sometimes they know me as the guy that does older young adult fiction and not middle grades and not upper elementary. And so I thought, wow, that's kind of frustrating. And for me, you fit in a tradition of people who write sports books for kids that goes from, Chris Crutcher, of course, is writing young adult literature, and Rich Wallace, but all the way back to in the 60s, a guy named Chris Tunis wrote fairly sophisticated novels for kids
I think it
about,
was John
yeah.
Tunis, not to correct
Is
you.
it John?
I
John?
thought it was, yes.
Yeah, well, it may be, and I just the only name I remember is Tunis, right? So I may be just shooting in the breeze, but
And what
it's
was
one of
interesting
those.
about those is that there was this change in children's literature, and those he originally, I believe, wrote those books for adults, and it was
Yep,
suggested that he switch them to younger adult and for kids. And those books, as I recall, were about adults, but they were written for children. And
yeah,
now, of
and it
course,
seems to me as I remember this, and you know, if I weren't retired, I'd really take it on as a project, right? But um, it seemed to me I remember reading those in like the fifth or sixth grade, because you and I are closer to a generation that remembers, going to the library, and that's where we got our books. But it seems to me that over the course of 10 or 11 books, he was telling the story of how a rookie joined a major league team, right? And it
yeah.
was and so you collected characters along the way, and knew them as kind of old guard left in and new guard comes in, and the characters would stay in the book. And I think books like that would probably sell today if kids had any access to it. But
Yeah,
I don't know.
I think a couple of things have happened, and that is, one, kids' books are now about kids,
Yeah.
and so I tend to write. The characters I write about tend to be about 13, 14 years old, somewhere around sort of seventh through ninth grade. In other words, they have to be good enough. Once somebody asked me, I said, you don't write fantasy. I said, well, actually, the fantasy is that the depictions of the games are the kids are playing better than most kids play, uh, and that's one of the things that's sort of part of the fantasy. But
Yeah,
the
that's
but I don't think writing about and so it was really sort of after World War II that they discovered that there was this young adult and young person's cohort, which they
Yeah.
started to write to, and the characters were that age. Actually, I thought you were going to talk about, if I could point to
Sure,
the
go
top
ahead.
shelf there, those are all the Chip Hilton books,
Oh
which
yeah.
were by Clair Bee back in the 40s, 50s, and then into the 60s. And
I'd
I was
forgotten
brought up on
about that
them.
one. Oh, I'm writing that down again. The Chip Hilton. Yes.
And those were the books that I fell in love. Those were, and they were about, and Chip and his buddies, they went through Valley Falls High School and then
Yeah.
to state, and he played, he was the football quarterback, he was the high scorer in basketball, and he was the pitcher in baseball. And while I now, looking back, of course, they were uh, a little, I don't think they would do very well now, their language and stuff. I just loved them as a kid.
Yeah.
Loved.
Well, and we grow up with different generations, right? And those kinds of things. And if we go back to books we love, we might find, oh, the language is stilted, or it's pretty
Oh,
wordy, or they, do this. But one of the things that, when we think about that stuff, the history of there's always been kind of people writing for kids in one way or another, series books, the Nancy Drew Factory and the Hardy's Boy Factory and those kinds of things, but they weren't kind of couched in I'm going to use the word realism that books like yours are, right? That they're with kids of a certain age that are concerned with the things that are those that age and the issues. Like I love how you said the fantasy is that they play better than most kids that age would play. Remember, I had a brother that was 4 years younger than me that was really a good athlete, and um, I can remember once going to, I think I had to ride my bike with him down to his game on a Saturday, and playing baseball in the summer. And I watched him pitch, and he must have been 8, 7 or 8, and just pitch and walked kid after kid, maybe 10 of them, right? And it was in the days before they had T-ball or any of that kind of thing. And it didn't phase him at all. But the only reason he was the one is he was probably one of the only kids on the team that could get the ball from the pitching mound across the plate.
well, that
you
was one of
know,
the things I had almost inadvertent research, and that was that I coached my son and my daughter. I coached more than 30, I believe, youth sports teams in baseball, basketball, soccer, and softball. And it was great research because all the stories were right in front of you.
right in front of you.
He
Yeah.
was frustrated about being on the bench. The kid who thought after one game he had it all figured out. And, it's sort of, I write about sports, but you're right. It's very realistic. And it the problems in the book that have to be solved involve the sports. Somebody once interviewed me and said, well, you've written about divorce. I said, no, I haven't. I've had characters whose parents have been divorced
Yeah.
because that's realistic. But their problem wasn't that their parents were divorced. It was that they couldn't pitch, or they weren't hitting, or
Yeah.
they were having problems within the team. And I don't, I think that the reason I do that is because a lot of kids, for them, sports is enormously important,
Oh, yeah.
and that they are learning a tremendous amount from their adventures or their stories on the field, and every bit as much as when they're, in the classroom. And so I remember one of the first games I coached. I was sort of all ready for it and stuff, and my wife said, She calls me Bo, and she said, Bo, you're kind of taking this seriously. I said, I'm taking it as seriously as the children are. And oh, okay, yeah, right. It's important to them. And
Yeah.
so
And
I've always, sometimes you get the whiff around sports and what people, think about it is, oh, well, it's just a game. No, not to the kids who are playing it. It's really important. And
yeah.
so, yeah, and so I think I try to convey that in the books that what the characters are going through are very important to them.
So how early did you start coaching your kids? From like Pee Wee on,
Oh,
or
the first, yeah, I remember somebody from Montgomery County. I live in Maryland.
yeah.
Called and sort of I'm sure she was just running through the parents and said, would you coach your son's first grade soccer team? And I remember, thinking for a moment. Yeah, I said, yeah, okay, I will. And she goes, you will? Like she was shocked. She had obviously gotten some no's. And then I just said to her, is it that bad? And no, 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 no. And so, and then after that season, they gave me a party, and I said, if you don't mind, I'll coach all the teams. And well, the party really took off after that.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
everybody was happy that, oh, Fred will coach all the teams. And I took my son, soccer, basketball, baseball. And then my daughter, who's 5 years younger, my wife looked at me. She said, you're not going to coach all the Carey's teams, are you? And I said, if I don't, no woman in the neighborhood would speak to me. I said, of course I am, and we had a great time. But it was great research.
Yeah.
Several of the books came out of those experiences.
Well, I coached high school soccer for quite a few years, and then when I said, after 10 years, I said I was really an English teacher at heart, but then
Yeah,
my kids started being old enough, so I coached a lot of soccer and some competition level soccer, mainly teams that were my kids on. Um, I had five kids, and so I coached the boys. I coached the girls teams a couple of times, but you can't be everywhere all at once. But
right.
but like you've got a son that's now coaching professionally baseball, right?
She's
And
the head baseball coach at University of Maryland, Baltimore County. And
wow, yeah,
actually, that experience I've been telling people has almost destroyed my interest in all other teams because it's amazing child,
yeah,
when your child's career depends on the game. It's a
yeah.
lot more important than, let's say, tonight's Celtics game.
Yeah,
You
yeah,
know,
that's
I
well. And
I'd like
one
to
of
see.
my sons is a professional soccer coach
Oh,
at a club level, and and he's traveled around. He's in Kansas City now, and I think will stay there for some time because he's got a kid starting the first grade. Doesn't want to move much anymore now, but he loves the young kids. The younger the better, right? Because for them they're still learning that it's fun to play and do the rules. And he says the biggest obstacle with kids from say 5 to 10 are the parents. They want it to be serious before the kids know it's serious. He said I could create a lot better players if they would just let me coach them, for 3 or 4 years and not worry about wins or losses. And then when the kids start worrying about it,
yeah.
they'll have the skills to do something about it, right?
No,
But sometimes we want them to win before they can throw the ball over home plate, right?
right, exactly. And one of the things that as a culture, we're always asking the kids, well, did you win? How'd
Yeah,
you do? And instead of sort of extolling effort or really getting better at something, I mean,
yeah.
that's what kids like. In fact, there was a study done by GW University, and they had, I think, they identified 81 fun factors. In other words, what
Oh,
made sports fun for kids, and winning came up like 44th. Traveling to tournaments came up like 70.
yeah,
The things they really liked were, they liked getting better, they liked being with their friends, they liked the exercise, they liked the, the, the team chemistry, all those things. And
yeah,
so one of the first things we fail kids in sports is we don't ask the kids, well, what do you
Yeah.
like? And instead, I mean, I remember one time I was coaching. It was like 9-year-olds or something. It was getting dark, and it was a baseball game, and it ended in a tie. And I said to the other coach, well, why don't we, it'll just be a tie. He said, oh, no, we got to go to extra innings. I said, it's a 9-year-old kid's baseball game. We don't have to do anything.
Yeah.
No, but he insisted. And,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah. It's interesting. So tell, obviously you coached a lot, and I agree with you. I think the stories, I've thought about that. If I were ever going to try to write for adolescents or middle grades, I'd probably try to write some soccer stories, because they're just everywhere. And but I keep finding people like you that do it better than I think I could at this point. So I do that. So what drifted you from and like I say, it probably didn't happen in a night, and maybe you're still practicing law to some degree, but
no, I'm
you
about
were a practicing attorney, and how did you move from that to writing, and what was that transition? Or
the whole thing sort of happened mostly as a lot of things happen is because I married the right person. Um, and my wife was a local journalist when we got married. We were both 28 years old. And we used to hang out with her journalist friends. And they were a real fun group. And one party, what was it? Her editor came over and said, Fred, you're funny. You love to tell stories. You love movies. How would you like to write movie reviews for me? And I thought, hey, that'd be fun. And so I did. And that gave me practice at, writing for a general audience
yeah,
and trying to be, entertaining and that kind of thing. And then my son came along. He was born to us, and I was kind of disappointed that my wife wouldn't let me go to all these movies by myself anymore. So I quit the column, but then at that point, movies were transitioning to videos. And
oh
so
yeah,
I found a column that would allow me to talk about movies that were coming out in video. And
all
so I
right,
didn't have to leave the house or anything. And I did that for a couple of years. And then by about, oh, I don't know, uh, probably when my son was about 5 or so, I started reading him sports books. And I thought, these aren't very good. And unlike most people who would say that, I had some experience writing. And therefore, I, I thought I'll try my hand at this. And I wrote one that was pitched a little higher, sort of maybe more like young adult.
mm-hmm.
And I sent it to an agent. And I remember she said, well, this doesn't really work. The mystery part of it was sort of, as she said, pulled in by the shirt tail. That was bad. But she said, when you write about sports, you're really good. And so I thought, oh, okay, well, maybe instead of trying to get in all these, a mystery or teenage romance or something,
Yeah,
maybe I should concentrate on the sports. And so I took some time off and wrote the first draft of my first book, which was TJ's Secret Pitch. And then because my wife and I are friends of a woman who writes for the American Girl series,
oh,
Valerie Tripp, I realized, oh, they always put history in the back of each of the books. I mean, sports has this incredible history.
yeah,
And to work in the history and then have a chapter of history in the back. And the first book was about a kid, TJ, who wanted to be a pitcher, couldn't throw it very hard, comes up with the old blooper pitch. And so I explained to the kids, oh, the blooper pitch was started by Rip Sewell, who took up the pitch because he was accidentally shot in a hunting accident and he had
oh,
buckshot in his feet and so couldn't push off as hard and throw the ball as hard. And so, and the day that he was injured in the hunting accident was December 7th, 1941. And so you
Wow.
kind of like, wow, it's one of those times where when you're researching and you think, oh my goodness, this is perfect. And
Yeah.
so I started to, so all the books are sort of a combination of um, the history element, uh, the theme, and there's also sort of a lesson thrown in.
Yeah.
And so, and the plot and stuff. So, and then so I started to get the idea for a series of books that would combine sports fiction, sports history, always have a chapter of sports history at the back. And I went to a conference and I met the sister of the publisher at Peachtree Publishers.
Oh,
I was told later that the publisher came along and asked her sister at the conference, said, well, how's it going? She said, well, kind of slow. But I met a guy and I think he's got a really good idea. And that, when my manuscript showed up, Margaret Quinlan was, ready to receive it. So that's how I started with Peachtree.
yeah. I've done this long enough now. I've been in the academic world for 20 years, and then the amount of serendipity that authors get when they, get published is it's not to be dismissed, right? The right conversation and or not being afraid to have a conversation, or like me sending you an email and saying, "Hey, Fred,
Yeah.
let's get to know your books a little better and see if I can use this
Also,
platform for people to know more about what you're doing." Right?
yeah. And it's also you have to be open enough to, well, first try new things.
Yeah.
Uh, then also to be, I don't know how the real, you know, internal people, people who are the introverts do
Yeah.
it. It's very natural for me to go up to somebody and start talking to them. Whereas, and I think that that's over the long haul is sort of an advantage. But
Yeah. I think so. I think it is harder for some of them that are quieter, more introverted, and kind of are suited to a writing life, but they sometimes haven't got the avenue to get that first book published, right? Or get the
the
first
other
thing
thing
done.
too is, and what I have found is now the first book was 1996. So in the last 28 years, you realize how much of a writer's life is promoting
Yeah.
uh, the books. And in order to be the best advocate for your book, even if you're an introvert, you have to have some ability to become more extrovert. And that you have to, if you're not going to be enthusiastic about your books, I don't know how you can expect other people.
Yeah. Well, you've been able to keep publishing since that first book.
Yeah.
Now, have you done school visits and that kind of business all along? And do
Oh
you
yeah.
do them across the U.S. or more in your region?
Well, a little bit of both. I don't do as many school visits now since after COVID.
Yeah.
Uh, I also was sort of naturally but oh my goodness, 20. Well, first of all, I was working full time as an attorney
Yeah.
time when I was starting the books and starting the series, and also when I was doing all those movie reviews and things like that. I was an attorney for like 30 plus years. And but it was actually, and I realized, oh, wait a second, you can, it's actually a very lucrative part of an author's life to do school visits.
Yeah.
That, oh, you can get paid for this. Great. And I remember one of the first ones that I did, my wife was sort of along and she was watching me just make sure I was doing this right. And also, you know, kindly critiquing me.
Yeah.
And she once she said to some teacher who was in the back of the room while I was giving my presentation, she said, "I always thought Bo would have made a wonderful teacher." And the teacher looked at her and said, "What do you think he's doing now?"
Yeah.
And what it is that I do a presentation on the writing process, how I
Yeah.
write my books and my columns. And so I always feel really good about it because the kids, oh, you start off with these messy notebooks and then you got to come up with ideas. Where do your ideas come from? They come from,
Yeah.
the usual stuff that even kids know. I always ask them, I say, what do you guys do at lunch? Oh, we talk. What are you talking about? And they start telling me what they talk about. And I said, you're telling each other stories all the time. You just don't write them down. That's all. And, sort of trying to simplify it. But and so, yeah, I did, oh my goodness, hundreds. And I was just recently I probably went to, I don't know, 20, 25 different states around the country over the years. So, and it was fun, but it was work. But I didn't
Yeah.
do as many as a lot of the uh, authors would do because I had a full time job most of the time.
Yeah. It's and as teachers, we sometimes, need to keep encouraging those kids that are writing.
Yeah,
I had a student that, was always writing poetry, and most of it wasn't, very good because she was, a 10th grader and 11th grader, and now she's a professor at Brigham Young University who's won a Guggenheim, for her poetry.
right.
So,
You know,
but you keep writing, Kim. That's good. You got good ideas. Keep writing.
well, and it's a lesson to sort of everybody. I would say to kids, you know, oh, do you guys, play basketball?
Yeah.
Oh, we love basketball. Well, did you the first time you shot the basketball, did you get it in? Oh no, it took a while. Right, and you keep at it. And anything, nobody's nobody's good at something right away. You do get better, and you become, more competent at it. I will say, however, I mean, obviously there are some people who, writing comes more naturally to them, and I think this is where being a lawyer was very helpful. Is that really, particularly with the columns, writing a column, you first have to figure out what you think about something, and
Yeah.
you have to organize it. And, writing a legal brief is you're making an argument and you are organizing it in a way that, oh, they should just, I remember one of the secretaries in the office, saying she was typing up the brief and she gave it back to me and she said, I don't see how they could think any other way. You know, that's right.
And you think,
Exactly.
yeah, that's the goal, right?
And I used to tell them, if you don't understand something, you tell me. If you're
Yeah.
typing it up and you don't understand it, you tell me and I will change it. And
Yeah.
because it's actually, I always think, very, very effective. I mean, always think about your audience when you're writing. And when you're a lawyer, you're thinking about the judge's clerk. And the judge's
Uh-huh.
clerk is looking at brief after brief after brief. Doesn't want something, he or she doesn't want something that's complicated and and then a big thick footnote. No, I remember starting a brief in the Ninth Circuit and just say, first sentence, this is a simple case, big, period. And then go on to explain exactly why it is a very simple case.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I'm sure that first sentence, I'm sure that the the clerk said, "Oh, thank goodness, a simple."
Well, that's great. So have you over the years tracked I haven't asked this with anybody before, but interesting because when I went to our local library, we retired up to Southern Utah. They have a couple of your book digitally, but they had no hard copies at the branch I was in. So have you tracked where your books have been put in libraries and where they are, or is
Actually, they do pretty well in libraries. I know that we've what was it? We were out in Denver, a few years ago when our daughter was getting her master's, and we went to bookstores there, and they had the books, and so they have had a audience. I mean, what was it? A couple of years ago, it was 25 years, and there were several articles, and Peachtree say, well, he's sold close to 1 million books. You know,
Yeah.
when you think the average book sells 3,000 copies,
Yeah.
and the majority of books never sell a thousand copies, they've had some reasonable success, and so they have found an audience, and that's why I always say to people when they ask me or they say, "Oh, I'd love to do what you're doing." I said, "Well, if you're good at it, you know what you get." And they're all thinking, "Oh, you get to be rich and famous." I said, "You get to write more books.
Yeah. If you're good at it.
Right? If you're successful, you will be allowed to write more books." And I once read somewhere where something like 50% of the authors only write one book,
One book.
and
Yeah.
it's because the book fails, and then it's like, oh, you go to the next publisher and I have an idea for a second book. How'd your first book do? Well, not very well.
Yeah.
Okay. So you've already shown, you know,
Yeah.
before you were just maybe you could do this. Now, oh, we're sure you haven't been very successful at doing it. And that's a
Yeah.
tough position to be in.
It's an interesting dilemma because I'd be interested if there are times of the year or places in the country where age demographics are such that your book gets picked up in upper elementary grades or middle schools, or I don't know if Peachtree's got any kind of arrangements where they're
I don't
connected
know.
with book sales or anything like that in schools.
I don't know. One thing is over the years, it's kind of fun. You get fan mail, and somebody
Yeah.
write you and say, and they're usually boys, I'll admit,
Hmm.
most of my books are popular with boys who like sports, although I have some girl readers. Um, and you'll, get this letter, and it's the return address is a school or the kid's house or something. And now you go on Google Maps and you go to the town and you think, oh, I remember there was like some town, it may have been in like Utah or Idaho or
Yeah.
something. And I thought, how the heck did this kid get a hold of my book?
Yeah.
He's in the middle of nowhere. I mean, you sort of hit, that the map would go out, and oh,
Yeah.
finally hit a dot. So it's amazing, frankly, that kind of anybody gets books.
Yeah,
But
it's interesting because the one of the things we all worry about in education is we know that somewhere between the third and the fifth grade, kids quit reading. Most
yeah,
kids that learn to read and don't have some kind of block for reading, whether it's physical or mental um, ability that can't do it, they lose their interest. And
yeah,
boys faster than girls,
yeah.
right? So
Oh yeah,
if you've got a track record with boys who are interested in sports who are often not interested in anything else for a period of time, and you've got them reading, it's like I can remember I had a lacrosse was taken off, and I had a book by Joseph Bruchac that was a lacrosse book.
yeah,
Well, I couldn't keep it. It was gone off my back shelf
for sure.
all the time. I had to
Yeah,
buy two or three of them. Because all the kids were starting to play lacrosse. All these
yeah,
sophomores and were starting to pick up. And this was, 15 years ago or more.
yeah.
And I said, look, you don't have to steal it. You can just borrow it because somebody else might want it. And they said, well, we're passing it around. And I said, oh, okay.
Well,
But
and one of the things is that the I think that particularly, let's face it. I mean, the elementary schools are dominated by extremely dedicated, mostly women,
yeah,
and I think that they have a tendency to, as we all do, to promote books that they enjoy, or oh, this is a wonderful book, and sometimes there's the disconnect between what the boys want and what their teachers are maybe promoting or reading or whatever. And I think that my books really fill a certain gap, and that is they're realistic, as we've previously discussed, books that concentrate on sports. They don't concentrate on, as I was saying, family dynamics and things like that. The family's usually in the background. In fact, my third book I tried to write without any adult characters, but I couldn't quite do it. But but still that is, and it concentrates on some of the problems that kids encounter in sports. Um, you know, this one, Extra Innings, is about a
Yeah,
kid who's really working hard on his pitching. And
yeah,
he's realizing for the first time, oh, this is really work. You
yeah,
know, you have to really, and that really comes from my son was a pitcher and he was also a pitching coach. Now he's the head coach. But the pitchers, it is so important, that they really have to learn their craft. They
yeah,
have to work at it. And they all the athletes work at things. But the pitchers are, okay.
yeah. And it's, I think we can't underestimate the talent involved in pitching a baseball.
Oh,
It's a complex,
it is.
it's a
But
complex
the other
thing.
thing in the lesson of the book is sometimes, and this happens all the time in sports, sometimes you do things the best you can, and the uh, and you do your absolute best, and things don't turn out the way you wanted them, and
Yeah.
that is a really hard lesson. We're always telling kids, "Oh, you can be anything you want to be." Sorry, actually, you probably can't. You know,
Yeah. Yeah.
in other words,
Well,
you better have some plan Bs, and you better be able to accept disappointment. You
well,
know,
and maybe you know this better than I do, but it seems to me I remember that as a kid, Sandy Koufax
oh yeah,
was the epitome of a pitcher. But the stories, some of the stories I remember here, and maybe this is all legend, that he was so wild first coming out of high school and doing anything that one of the coaches had him throw balls to the outfield for the fielders to catch because no one knew where it was going to go, and he said just throw it out there, loosen up his arm.
story actually I put as the history in the book Throwing Heat, which is about a pitcher who is throws it hard, and he thinks that's the whole game.
Yeah.
Uh, in fact, the first chapter is he is at a county fair, and they have one of those pitching machines, and he's
Oh,
sort of bet his friends, I can throw at a certain you know miles per hour, and he runs into a pitching coach who's okay. Well, now you got to learn how to pitch. And by the way, all my books aren't about pitching; it just happens.
yeah.
But the history behind it is Sandy Koufax, and there was a famous moment or a spring training game back in the early 60s. And Koufax, they didn't bring many pitchers to the game. They had some split squad or something.
Yeah.
And so he's going to have to pitch quite a few innings, which they let him do back then. But
Yeah.
he like walked the first three guys. And the catcher came out to him and said, listen, Sandy, just let him hit the ball. I mean, we got to get out of here. We're going to be here all day. Well, he said, okay, I'll just let him, you know, let him hit the ball. And he was tremendous after that.
Yeah.
And the catcher came to him and said, Sandy, I am not lying to you. You're fine when you're, as he said, when you take the grunt out of every pitch.
Yeah.
Don't try to throw your hardest. In
Yeah.
fact, if you watch golf, they say those guys they're not trying to hit it as hard as they can most of the time. They're at about hit it in a controlled 90%.
Yeah.
That and the light came on, and for the next 5 years, he was Sandy Cope.
Yeah. Yeah. And he was a pitcher. I mean, I can remember those Dodgers Twins series. I don't know if there was ever two teams that went after each other harder than those two teams did in the series. So
I remember there was a batter who I think in the American League saw him in the World Series after one of the games. He said, "Well, he says I can see why he won 25 games this year. What I can't see is how he lost five." You know,
yeah, yeah,
he's in Boston.
yeah. That's an interesting dilemma. Well, it's so you've done this now, like I say, almost 30 years writing this. Are you going to keep writing, or are you kind of nearing the end?
Nobody retires from writing except for I think Philip Roth. He announced that he was going to, retire from writing. He had sort of won everything, and
Yeah,
I enjoy writing the stories. I still write articles for other, although I don't do it for the Post. I was contacted by a couple of groups if I would write articles for them. So I like to write, and for me, it's all these people who I have been on panels in which other writers, oh, it's so hard, and I suffer, and
yeah,
I say, listen, when I write my stories, I get to be 12 years old again. This is wonderful.
yeah,
You want suffering? Write legal briefs, with footnotes. And you have to, one of the things they're finding out, of course, with all our concentration on legal, proceedings is you can't just go in there and say stuff.
yeah,
You have to have evidence. And and you have to tie all your statements to evidence in the record.
yeah.
And I mean, that's that's a real discipline. Uh,
Well, and I think I was one of those guys in the English department that the guys I studied with, all wanted to go to law school, and I wanted to teach, and I changed my mind about going to law school about the second or third year when I realized how much I loved reading and talking to kids, and they made a mistake and let me, as a senior, I was teaching a writing clinic in a reading lab and stuff, so I was done. But I think too many people romanticize that the law is easy. We see these movies and we don't see all the tedium and the work that goes behind. Because I remember talking to a guy that I knew, one of my dad's parents, who became a federal judge in Vegas, Lloyd George. And I said, what do you need to do to go to law school? Not this before I went to college. He says, well, you need to write. You need to write all the time. He says, and I would recommend that if you really want to be a lawyer, you either major in English or accounting. He said, you either want to learn to write or count money, and figure out what's going on with money, you know.
well, it's interesting actually around Washington, and I live just outside of Washington,
Yeah,
D.C. There are any number of children's writers who are former attorneys, and I think one
yeah,
of it is because you have to write a lot as an attorney, and you often take a lot of material and boil it down to something, you know,
yeah,
and that is for children's writing. I think that's actually a very good skill because I get now kind of impatient. My wife was after me. She says, "Well, you don't read a lot of literary fiction." And I said, "No, I get a little tired of the chapter about the background of the whole town and
yeah,
history of this and that. I love history. I love social science, things like that. A lot of nonfiction, but the story has to be, you know, and that's what's paramount with kids literature is you have to have a good story. If you start writing about stuff that's not on what happens next, the kids will say, "Hey, wait a second, you
yeah,
know, what happened to? I thought he wanted to be
yeah. Why
wanted
are
to
we here now?
make playoffs or something."
See, that reminds me, and I hope John Grisham doesn't follow me. I'm quite sure, but my wife and I have been playing with a couples book club, right? And we read the Boys from Biloxi, one of his new books, and I liked it okay, but it reminded me that I like John Grisham's young adult stuff, which is really middle grade stuff, um, better than I like his adult stuff. Because and then I went back and checked out a couple. I thought, yeah, this this Theodore Boone, kid lawyer stuff is pretty good because it's really streamlined, right? He goes to the plot. He's got the problem that that he and his buddies want to know, and he practices his chops by going to defend people in animal court, who have a dog that barks too hard or whatever. And I think he's a storyteller, but sometimes in the adult ones, the story gets lost for the bushes, right, that are there. And I
Well,
think,
I often recommend to people um, sort of young adult nonfiction. In other
oh,
words, biography, a 200-page biography with pictures of some, well-known person. It sometimes can be exactly the amount that you want to know about that person, as opposed to a 700-page
yeah,
uh, biography that goes in, people who clearly just didn't want to not use all the research that they had done.
yeah. I'm a big fan of um, some of the nonfiction writers. Some are more sophisticated than others, writing for young adult, but um, Candace Fleming wrote a really wonderful book that just came out recently called The Enigma Girls, which
Yeah,
is kind of upper middle grades. And if you want to know about Bletchley Circle
yeah.
in a confined space and learn stuff that you didn't have any idea, the 10 or so people she highlights, it's a fascinating read.
Yeah. Well,
And again, you think
she's
then
terrific.
if you're interested in deeper stuff, go do it. But it's a
Sure.
great book. So what's next? You've got extra innings coming out. When does it hit the shelves?
Extra Innings is actually the hardback came out in, I believe, the spring, and I think the paperback is going to come out in the fall.
Oh,
The
okay.
following year, I'm going to do a football book, and I think it's the working title right now is Special Teams, and it's a kid who doesn't want to get stuck on special teams, but starts to learn. Oh, okay, I guess he wants to score touchdowns,
Uh,
and be the hero. And but then he starts thinking, oh, wait a second, special teams, punt returns. In fact, I looked it up. There's a guy named Devin Hester who scored 20 non-offensive touchdowns, and that means when the other team starts with the ball and maybe kicks it off to the other team,
yeah,
and that team takes it all the way back for touchdowns. And so, and I was actually one of the fun things I do now. Oh my goodness, YouTube is so much fun.
yeah.
Uh, is you can
Looking at all the sports
in
statistics.
or plug in Devin Hester and you see all his kickoff returns and you say, oh my goodness, this guy was unbelievable.
Yeah,
And so it's but as always, I mean, what I try to do is I try to write a fun story that'll keep the kids' interest, work in some history, and then, like I said, work in a lesson. And that one is sort of, I remember my son, the coach, told me one time he had to tell a pitcher or a player of his. The guy wanted to play in the field, and he also wanted to pitch. And my son said to him, he said, sometimes you don't get to choose your talent. He said, you're really a special pitcher. You're not as special in the field. And I know you want to do that, but you're just going to have to be satisfied with being the best pitcher in the conference.
yeah,
And he was a little disappointed with it, but, and it is true. Sometimes you have to, oh, and in fact, I work in, what was that one? The mother is playing the piano and worked in a line of a friend of mine from law school who was a wonderful piano player. And she'd gone to Oberlin and then she transferred. And so I said, why'd you transfer? Sort of leave music. I was good enough to know I wasn't good enough. And
yeah,
I thought, ooh, that's a good line. Took
yeah,
me about 45 years to use it, but I
yeah.
knew right away. I knew, oh, that's a really good line.
That is a good line, and I think that's a life lesson. It's
Yeah,
I as a teacher, it didn't take me very long to realize that most days I wasn't the smartest person in the classroom. You know, there were ninth graders that were often smarter than I was, right? I was just trying to, and if teachers can get out of the way of their own ego and direct traffic, you know, and let kids flourish, then I can still see this. I was working, kids were working in groups and they were doing these things called body biographies after reading Shakespeare, and each one had a character and they were trying to represent them, with an image. And I watched this girl coach these other three kids, and you know, the way she had them develop a body biography of Iago was just stunning, and I would have never thought of it. It's the way she was putting the images and which lines she was choosing, and getting them to buy her vision of what this body biography is going to look like, and coaching the kids who could draw and everything. And I thought, well, some of us are just smarter than others, right?
Well, when you think about it, one of the fascinating things, and I write about team sports all the time, is how the team comes together. And you need all these different skill, you know, levels and different. And one of the things that really gets a team going is when the role players accept their role. It's when, oh, okay, I, everybody wants to be LeBron James. I
Yeah.
mean, every kid in America wants to be LeBron James. And the kids who stay with it are the ones who, oh, okay, how do I help the team? And my son once said he was listening to what was it, a soccer coach in England. And they asked him about, he was one of the managers, and he was a well-known one. I forget what team. What about your own soccer career? And he gave a wonderful answer. He said, I was important for every team I played for. I wasn't the star, but I was important to the team. And
Yeah.
that is when you get that, when people get that. I always say every one of the things we really have in this country is a sickness with celebrity.
Yeah. Oh, I think absolutely.
Yeah. And what we really need are not America's Got Talent or America Stars. We need helpers. We need people who help out and who'll say, okay, how can I, what am I good at? How can I contribute? I used to say that all the time to my kids, find a way to contribute. And now, of course, my son is taking that to his
Yeah.
team. And my daughter is a school librarian. That's the way she
Oh,
can do it. And so,
good.
I mean, um, yeah, everybody, and we concentrate too much in sports about, oh, the stars, the winners.
Yeah.
We're going to have the Olympics. Somebody's going to come in fifth place and they're going to say, oh, are you disappointed? You're the
Yeah.
fifth best in the world.
Girl. Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, I think that looking at any of the Chicago Bulls teams with Michael Jordan on them, he was blessed with a lot of great supporting talent. And
My favorite stats on Michael Jordan, right,
yeah.
is the year he left NBA basketball to play baseball. You know how many fewer games the Bulls won uh, during the regular season the following year? Two.
Two. Yeah. Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
It wasn't just Michael Jordan. They
Yeah.
had a really good team. They were one game away from being in the championship series. They got beat
Yeah.
by the Nets in like
Yeah.
seven. You know.
It's interesting to look at those players that that stay around for
Oh yeah.
years, right? That Matt De La Pena likes to tell the story. He's a writer, and he kind of started writing some young his sports books, but he played basketball in college and thought, well, I'll be in the NBA, And then he says, I guarded this kid once in a tournament named Steve Nash. and he says, I realized, oh, there's somebody that plays this position quite a bit better than I do. You know,
Well,
Maybe I
yeah.
should look at all their alternatives.
Well, think about all the how the internationalization of sports too.
Yeah,
Luka Doncic.
yeah,
When we were growing up, Luka Doncic would not have even come over here. He would have been
Yeah.
over in Europe somewhere, and
Yeah.
maybe not even playing basketball.
Yeah.
Now, I just talked to a guy at the University of Maryland, and he teaches journalism over there. And he just led a group of 10 students over to Africa to watch the African Championship games, which are now the NBA is looking for players in Africa.
Right. Yeah.
So when I wrote a column, I remember I told kids, I said, well, it used to be, you try to be the best in your league and then the best in your town and maybe the best in your conference. But when you get up to the pros, you are saying, I am one of the best in the world.
Yeah.
And that's a big mountain to climb.
Yeah, it is indeed. Well, Fred, it's been great talking with you. I've loved getting to know you a little bit better, and we'll do what we can to promote your books. And I hope
Great.
I run into you at a conference at NCTE or Allen or something, and
Yeah,
it
it would
would be
be,
great.
fun. Well, thanks. First of all, thanks for your interest in my books, but also just generally, thanks for the interest in young people's literature, because I think it's a golden age of
Oh, there's no question about it. I think middle grades is growing, more books for boys, more books for girls. Um, Not even to mention that the fantasy and science fiction world are just exploding. It's not my primary interest, but
yeah. I don't.
really great stuff is being written there, and it's there's lots to choose from. So it's really great.
Well,
Well,
you don't. If people say, "Oh, my kid isn't, interested in reading," I said, well, gee, just go into a library, go to
yeah,
a bookstore, say what they're interested in. If you can't find a book, you're not trying.
yeah.
Uh, and
I think that's the key thing, that we need to let kids explore a little bit more. And it's okay if they check out 10 books and read one of them or read two of them. They'll find what they're looking for, you know.
oh, absolutely. And I think just getting into the habit of it. Well, one of the best pieces of advice I ever got, I can't remember now if it was one of the nuns who told me that I taught me or one of my parents. I get those sort of mixed up sometimes.
Yeah.
But somebody told me always, if somebody asks you, what are you reading? Always be able to give them an answer truthfully. In other words, I'm reading such and such. So when you stop a book, you just start a book
Yeah.
pretty much,
Yeah, that's pretty good. Well, it's great to have you as a guest, and we'll hope we'll do it again sometime.
Okay, that would be fun. You take care. All right.
Bye bye.
Bye bye.